This episode is brought to you by Christendom, a big tent platform for Catholic content creators. Say goodbye to endlessly browsing for Catholic content. At Christendom, we make it simple to follow, share, and save your favorite creators' content. Join our community at christendom.app. It's free.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the weekly program where we sort through the flotsam and jetsam of the last week in the Vatican beat, looking for those few important moments, those peak moments that deserve a pride of place in your consciousness if you want to dazzle your friend and neighbors with your command of Vatican literacy. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with Salt March. The closest thing the Vatican has to a trade union has declared a kind of sweeping effort of nonviolent civil disobedience to transform the Vatican, much in the way that Gandhi used his Salt March to commence the program of nonviolent civil disobedience that eventually led to the emancipation of India. We'll explain what's going on and what the potential consequences might be. Second, we've got Don't Go West, Young Man, if I can paraphrase Horace Greeley. One of the interesting elements of the Synod of Bishops on Synodality currently unfolding in Rome is the way that the two-thirds church, that is, the more than two-thirds of the Catholic Church these days that is outside Western civilization, is using this opportunity to tell the affluent church in the West basically to buzz off. We'll explain how and what the implications of that are. Third, we've got of synodality and structures, how one of the lasting consequences of this Synod on Bishops might actually be an effort to translate synodality and to institutionalize it in the legal code of the Catholic Church when it comes to things such as conferences of bishops, parish councils, finance councils, and so on. We'll explain all of that. Fourth, this week, we've got the trouble with Tuccio, how the Pope's doctrinal czar was a no-show at a keenly anticipated meeting with one of the study groups during this Synod of Bishops, and how his disappearing act has generated, well, a no small amount of irritation and what this might mean going forward. Finally, this week, we've got a footnote to hope, how a bit of marketing verbiage being used with regard to Pope Francis's upcoming autobiography is not only inaccurate, but threatens to overshadow one of the truly awesome footnotes to church history of all time. All that and more is waiting for you on this episode of Last Week in the Church. So please, in the name of everything that is right, just, and true, do not go anywhere, because I will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. Happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, October 22nd, 2024. Hope you had a great weekend. If you are a baseball fan, and of course, if you are a right and just person, you must be a baseball fan. You woke up the early part of this week on bended knee, thanking a loving God that he has given us a Yankees-Dodgers World Series. Yes, the most fabled matchup in all of baseball history is back on the menu for this year's Fall Classic. Alas, night games are too late for me to follow in real time here in Rome, but I will of course be following replays. This is one, if you are a baseball person, this is one of the great moments. The last time the Yankees and the Dodgers met in the World Series, by the way, was in 1981. I was a sophomore in high school. So I've been waiting a long time for this. I intend to take full advantage. I encourage all of you to do it. It is not only good for the sport, it is good for your soul. All right, we begin this week with a Salt March. So, the Association of Lay Employees in the Vatican, which is the closest thing the Vatican has to a trade union, had a meeting of its executive committee this past week in which they selected a new Secretary General, that is, the new face and voice of lay employees in the Vatican. It is a 51-year-old woman by the name of Paola Monaco. She currently works for the Pontifical Committee for International Eucharistic Congresses. Prior to that, had spent about 18 years working for various financial oversight entities in the Vatican. First, the Prefecture for Economic Affairs, which doesn't exist anymore, and then later for the Council for the Economy. And in an open letter that she published on the occasion of her election, she said that Vatican employees are launching what she described as a salt march aimed at ushering in a new era. Now, of course, the reference is to the famous march launched by Mahatma Gandhi in March of 1930 to protest the policy of the British colonial rulers of India had imposed that prohibited Indians from producing their own salt, even though India is a salt-rich country, thereby forcing them to purchase heavily taxed imports and lining the pockets of British companies and the colonial officials who were on their payroll, okay? And that salt march ended up being, well, basically setting the dominoes tumbling that eventually led to the end of British colonial rule and Indian independence 17 years later in 1947. So obviously, to invoke that now for what lay employees are trying to do in the Vatican is a pretty ambitious notion, right? What Paola Monaco said is that they want to usher in a new era in which labor and management in the Vatican sit down around a common table, conscious of their equal dignity, their equal human dignity, which she said transcends all hierarchical differences. And they can come up with solutions that are fair and reasonable for all parties involved. She closed with the line that the voice of workers can no longer be ignored, said it is anachronistic to think that decisions can be made unilaterally and imposed from on high. Now, that is very beguiling rhetoric. However, I think most people who work in the Vatican would say it is about as far from the lived reality of the place as, say, India in 1930 was from Gandhi's vision of an emancipated and independent country. Look, I mean, I have known over the almost 30 years I've been covering this place, I have known lots of people who have worked in the Vatican, more than I could possibly ever count. Not just laity, by the way, but also clergy and religious, virtually all of whom have described a work environment in the Vatican that is pretty antiseptic and cold, in which creativity is not really encouraged, in which collaboration and communication across departmental lines is actively discouraged, and in which most superiors operate out of a kind of command and control model of leadership. So, is it realistic to think that Paola Monaco and this intrepid band of around 700 Vatican employees can change all of that? Well, maybe, maybe not, but I would suggest that a couple of things are different today that perhaps give them hope. One is everybody knows the Vatican's financial situation is dreadful. In the future, they are going to have to cut payroll in order to cut costs. That means the workforce that is left is going to have to work harder, smarter, faster, and better. They're going to have to know how to multitask and how to communicate across departmental lines. All of that means the system will need them more than they need the system, which may give the workforce a bit more leverage. Secondly, one of the reasons the Vatican has been able to get by treating its workers, well, I'm tempted to say something off-color, inappropriate for a family program. Let me just say, treating their workers not so nicely, okay, is that traditionally there has been a vast pool of young Italians who, because of Italy's chronic youth unemployment problem, has been willing to take even demeaning and unsatisfying jobs in the Vatican because they're secure. I mean, it beats unemployment, right? However, that has changed. Italy's youth unemployment rate, which was almost 48% in 2014, today is only 18% and is dropping quickly because of the demographics of Italy. Italy is today the oldest country in the European Union. It has the lowest fertility rate in the European Union. There simply aren't that many young people anymore, and those young workers who are going to be entering the workforce can therefore afford to be much pickier. If the Vatican doesn't clean up its act, it may find it has difficulty filling slots. And then finally, of course, there's the disjunction between Pope Francis's rhetoric on synodality and the actual practice in the Vatican itself. At some point, the cognitive dissonance is simply going to become unsustainable. So, going to be fascinating to watch Paolo Monaco and, her merry band try to rewrite what has essentially been centuries of internal culture in the Vatican. You have to cheer for the effort. Whether it happens or not, I don't know, but I will say this. If it succeeds, it will be far more meaningful than anything likely to come out of the Synod that is going on this month. All right? Speaking of the Synod, let us shift gears to topic number 2, which is don't go west, young man. Of course, that is a paraphrase of the famous Horace Greeley line, go west, young man, which was an expression of the concept of manifest destiny in the 19th century, that America was destined to occupy and exploit the West, all of the continental United States up to the West Coast and the Pacific Ocean. Well, I'm talking about the West not in the American context, but in the global one. Western civilization, which has dominated the Vatican for the better part of, 1,500 years. But its, monopoly on running the show in the global church may be coming to an end. And if that is the case, Synod 2024 may be remembered as one of those watershed moments in which the new reality became clear. Here's what I mean. It has been, obvious for a while that some of the hot button issues some of us thought were going to dominate this Synod, such as, the women's issue, and especially the ordination of women as deacons, LGBTQ plus issues, and especially the idea of blessing of same-sex unions, maybe married priests. Those issues have largely been taken off the table by papal or Vatican fiat. Now, that has been attributed in many quarters to simply Pope Francis not wanting the Synod to be bogged down by a few very controversial matters and wanting it to be able to treat a broader range of issues. And I'm sure that's true as far as it goes, but there is another factor in all of this, which is the portion of the church which these days is found outside the West and which sees those issues largely as the bugaboos of affluent, deep-pocketed, too much time in their hands churches in the West, is frankly just a little tired of having them crammed down their throats. This became explicit during a briefing for the media during the Synod when Bishop Anthony Randazzo of Broken Bay in Australia basically said these issues are niche issues that are of concern mostly to the church in the West, and for local churches that are dealing with life and death matters such as war, such as chronic poverty, such as disease, such as climate change, and on and on. The idea that our energies ought to be devoted to whether or not we're going to have female deacons, rather than is the war in Gaza going to end, or are hundreds of millions of people going to be consigned to early death because we cannot crack the nut with chronic long-term poverty? I mean, he would say on behalf of much of the church that is not in the West, that's an obscenity. That's just ridiculous. And let us bear in mind a basic piece of math. There are 1.3 billion Roman Catholics in the world today. More than 2/3 of them do not live in Europe, North America, or those other pockets of the world we traditionally consider part of Western civilization. By mid-century, that share is going to be 3/4. And basically, at this Synod, the consistent message from the top on down has been that the moment in which the West got to call the tune is over. For instance, Pope Francis on October 6th appointed 21 new cardinals. When the Vatican chose to ask 3 of them to speak on behalf of the new cardinals at a Synod briefing, it chose a cardinal from Africa, Ivory Coast, a cardinal from Asia, Japan, and a cardinal from Latin America. Do you remember, Elise? What country in Latin America? Brazil, that's right. Archbishop Jaime Spengler of Brazil. So, in other words, non-Western cardinals, all right? And so, if you were looking for the significance of this Synod of Bishops, it may not exactly be in outcomes, but it may more be in who is running the show, whose voice is setting the tone in the discussions in this Synod. And perhaps for the first time in recent memory, we could say a major global event has taken place in Rome in which the Church in the West was not the unquestioned 800-pound gorilla dominating every question. And that in itself, ladies and gentlemen, has significance. All right. Third up this week, we have of synodality and structure. So if we are desperately looking for something of long-term consequence, which may come out of this concluding act of the long-running Synod on synodality, one area in which we might go looking for it is a push that has emerged in this Synod to find ways to translate the spirit of synodality into the legal structures of the Church. This is important for this reason. You know, in February, I was in Los Angeles for the Religious Education Congress there. It's the largest annual gathering of Catholics in North America. And while when I was not giving my own talks, because a good chunk of my time was devoted to doing that, but when I wasn't occupied, myself, I caught a couple of talks being given by other speakers, one of whom was Cardinal Robert McElroy of San Diego, who was asked the question, will synodality outlive Pope Francis? And his answer, which I will never forget, was, I think so, I hope so, I'm not sure. And I think that captures the spirit of a lot of people who are fans of this idea of synodality, that is, shared governance, democratization, participatory decision-making, and so on. The concern that it has become the buzzword par excellence under Pope Francis, but the moment he steps off the stage, it may go the way of the dodo bird. And to prevent that, they are looking for ways to try to write it into law so that it's not so easily reversed. What are the instruments for doing that? Well, some of them that have come up at this Synod would be, for instance, parish councils or pastoral councils, which are provided for in the Code of Canon Law of the Catholic Church, but they are simply optional. These are, of course, parish-level bodies that include lay people and so on, that advise the pastor on all kinds of things, from mundane questions such as what should Mass times be, or should CCD classes meet Thursday night or Saturday morning, or whatever, up to higher order things such as what sort of liturgies should we have, what should our ministries for the homebound look like, and so on. Now, under the current Code of Canon Law, it is not obligatory that every parish must have a pastoral council. Canon 536 of the Code says it is at the discretion of the bishop to decide whether parishes in his diocese will have these things. And of course, even if they do exist currently under the Code, they are completely consultative. They don't have any actual decision-making authority because it is always completely and exclusively in the hand of the pastor, that is the priest, to make decisions. Now, similarly, the Code of Canon Law requires parishes to have a finance council and also dioceses, that is a body that is supposed to give its advice on financial management. But under the Code, it too has merely a consultative role, and ultimately it is up to the pastor or the bishop to make decisions in that area as well. So some in the Synod are saying, look, pastoral councils should become obligatory, not optional, and we should write in certain areas, both for pastoral councils and for finance councils, where pastors and bishops are required to have the approval of these councils, not merely encouraged. So for a finance council, you might say, if a parish wants to make a purchase or a sale exceeding, I don't know, I'm picking a number out of the clear blue sky, but over $10,000, then the pastor is required to have the approval of his finance council. Or in order to change the age of confirmation, for instance, or some important pastoral decision. The pastor is required to have approval. On another level, there's also been a great deal of discussion and debate about bishops' conferences, national bishops' conferences, and whether they should have some kind of doctrinal teaching authority recognized in church law. At present, the governing documents on this matter are Apostola Suis ad Tuendum Fidem. They're both documents from the late 90s that came out under Pope John Paul II, but were largely authored by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI. And they essentially said that bishops' conferences have no teaching authority whatsoever. There are some in the Synod who think it's time to revisit that and perhaps acknowledge some teaching authority to national bishops' conferences as a sort of offset to this tendency to think that Rome has to answer every question that comes up in the life of the Catholic Church. We will see to what extent these proposed revisions to church law have any legs, because there certainly is significant resistance to all of them in the Synod as well. In other words, there are some proposing it, others opposing it. We will see how it all shakes out. But if you were trying to identify some place where the legacy of synodality may outlive the author of synodality, that is Pope Francis, this might well be one of them. All right, fourth up this week, we have the trouble with Tucho. Tucho is the nickname for Argentinian Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, who is the prefect of the Vatican's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. In other words, he is Pope Francis's doctrinal czar. Now, Fernandez got things off to a rocky start in this synod when let me back up and say that in the run-up to this synod, Pope Francis had indicated that certain issues were going to be assigned not to the full body of the Synod, but to smaller study groups that he created. In the end, there were 10 such groups. And that those groups were going to take into consideration not only the advice of the Synod, but other factors as well. And they've been asked to deliver final reports to Pope Francis by June 2025, so summer of next year. Now, one of those study groups, Study Group 5, is devoted to theological and canonical aspects of certain forms of ministry. Now, that may sound a bit abstract and fuzzy, but among other things, what that means is this is the group looking at the question of whether women can be ordained deacons, which everybody expected would be a hot button matter coming into the Synod. Now, it's been taken off the table for the Synod, given to the study group. So when the Synod organizers announced that this past Friday, the study groups would hold meetings for Synod participants, so that if you are one of the roughly 400 people taking part of the Synod, you could go into this meeting, give your 2 cents, ask questions, figure out what in the world is going on, and so on. Turned out that by far the most popular of these meetings was the one on forms of ministry, meaning the one dealing with female deacons. And, even like cardinals and other Vatican officials showed up for this meeting because everybody thought they were going to have a chance to discuss this with Cardinal Fernandez, who was the head of this committee as the prefect for the dicastery of the faith. Let me point out, by the way, that this study group is the only one that has not published a list of its members. All of the other study groups have been transparent as to who belongs to them. This one has not. So anyway, people thought they were finally going to get some straight answers from Fernandez. Instead, when they walked into this meeting, there were 2 junior officials from the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith who handed out pieces of paper saying, you can write down your questions or concerns and we'll collect them and then, turn them into the big boss. I mean, it was like a study hall in junior high, right? When you get into trouble and they put you in a room and say, copy these sentences 100 times. I mean, it was basically busy work. And everybody who was there found themselves tremendously insulted and irritated by this dynamic. One participant, who was a veteran of the Vatican's diplomatic corps, pointed out that it is a basic principle of diplomacy that if you invite someone to a meeting, you make sure that you have somebody there who is at least of equal rank to the people you've invited. So if you're going to have the foreign minister of a country here, you don't send the guy who opens the mail in the State Department to meet him. You make damn sure that Anthony Blinken is sitting there. All right? Now, in the wake of all this, Tucho has apologized. He has said that he is going to have another meeting where he will come. And initially, this was supposed to be yesterday, Monday. It then got moved till Thursday. There is still a little bit of uncertainty as to when this is all going to happen. But in any event, when and if it does, it's obviously worth keeping an eye on. We will have full coverage on the Crux site. All right. Finally, this week, we've got a footnote to hope. So it was announced this past week that Pope Francis, for the last several years, has been working with an Italian publisher on an autobiography. It's to be entitled Hope. And originally, the idea was it would only be published after Pope Francis's death. But instead, he has now decided it will be published in January so that it can be part of the discussions and the spirit, if you like, of the Jubilee year in 2025. Frankly, I think some of this may be pressure from the publisher who thought, when this Pope hit 80, he couldn't be around much longer. Well, it's 7 years later and he's going strong and doesn't show any signs of stepping off the stage anytime soon. And so they decided maybe, oh, hell with it. Let's just put it in now. Anyway, I noticed this week that in much of the marketing material, including the materials being put out by Random House in the United States, which is the American publisher of the autobiography, this is being described as the first ever autobiography by a sitting pontiff. Now, thing is, that is just factually not true. First of all, you ought to be very careful in using the phrase first ever with regard to an institution that has more than 2,000 years of history. As the late Cardinal Francis George once said in the Catholic Church, everything has happened at least once. But secondly, all you had to do was check the archives of Crux to know this is false. And the fact that such an august publisher as Random House failed to do that is a source of great scandal and umbrage. But anyway, the point is this. In the 15th century, Pope Pius II, whose given name was Aeneas Piccolomini, wrote what amounts to an autobiography, which is published under the title of Commentaries, which you can easily find on Amazon or wherever else you want to, your local Catholic library, wherever you want to go looking for it. And this is important not merely just to set the historical record straight, but because Commentaries contains Pius II's reflection on one of the great forgotten codicils of church history of all time, which is the one and only reverse canonization ever performed in the history of the Catholic Church. A reverse canonization is when a pope uses his infallible authority not to say that a particular soul is in heaven, but instead to say that a particular person is destined for hell. Pius II did this in 1462 with respect to a lay lord by the name of Sigismundo Pandolfo Malatesta. You can find the full story on the Crux site if you're interested. But the point is, if we forget about Pius II's autobiography, we forget this story, which is one of the great Catholic stories of all time. We dare not let that happen. So, say what you want about Pope Francis's autobiography, but do not say it is the only one, because, ladies and gentlemen, it ain't. And frankly, you should read the other one too. All right, that is our show for this week. You can find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site, that is cruxnow.com. I will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. We'll cover the curtain falling on the Synod of Bishops on synodality and everything else that is hot and bothered in the Catholic world. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week, and I will talk to you again very soon.